But the first step of noting is when the material arrives, we note that in fact, oh, we actually wanted to get this, going back to the first step, and we got it, and it's what we wanted, and we paid the right amount, and it got here on time, and a whole slew of things associated with due diligence on the getting process of the material. This process creates kind of an initial preliminary record, kind of along the way to a continuum of access. It says, all right, we've got what we want. We can use this preliminary information to say, all right, this is the thing, and now we can start managing this object or concept or idea or information resource within the library. Which leads us to one of my favorite steps as a cataloger, is metadata. What is metadata? Well, data about data. Metadata is something like this preliminary record, which you probably can't read from this image, but it tells you what the title of the material is. What is it about? How does it work? How big is it? What color is it potentially? Although we don't normally do that one, but that's a potential. Cutter kind of created the American idea of metadata, and Outlet talked about the surrogate for the physical item. And the idea is that we have these information resources out there somewhere, and then we also have these metadata tokens, or metadata objects, which correspond to those, and are much easier to manage. Because if we had to shuffle our books every time we were looking for a book on cats, it would be a huge nightmare. So an example of metadata, having begun the continuum of access and now passed on to cataloging where the metadata is further enhanced, you end up with something that looks like this, which is actually quite humble looking. It's a very small little record. I like this example. It's actually Cowboy Small, which is written in the initial teaching alphabet, which if you've not seen it, looks ridiculous. It was intended to teach phonetic reading of English, but is a great example of a strange book. And what you can notice about this is towards the bottom you have some subject headings, you have a description of what it looks like, very simple record. Except that it's not so simple. Again, remember, we're talking 12 million items here. And in the world, we're talking billions of items. So we want to make sure we actually write things down in the same way, you know? If I say this one is about cowboys, juvenile fiction, and another book comes out, I want to make sure they apply the same heading if it's about the same subject. And so we have standards like the AACR2 and NACO and cooperative databases like OCLC so that our records can not only be found locally in a standard way, but found more broadly. Of course, sometimes we have more specialized materials that need more specialized standards, or sometimes we're in more specialized databases that need more specialized standards. And it just keeps going and going. And there are tons and tons of these international, national, etc. standards that guide the construction of these seemingly simple records. In a way, what's being created with metadata is not purely a surrogate for an object at this point. It's more of a rhizome that connects to bodies of knowledge. You have this book in the initial teaching alphabet about a cowboy. It needs to be found here and fit within our scheme of knowledge, but it also needs to fit within OCLC's, the Online Computer Library Consortium's scheme of knowledge, who acts as a de facto union catalog. And in the same way, there are tons and tons of these systems. And so a simple record represents this layered structure. I like to use the word epistemography to describe what exactly this is, but it's the building of connections. So, another metaphysical process gone through, connections built within these systems that have little to no effect on the physical or information resource, the material can move on to the next step, which is prep. Materials which are not actually here are not findable, even if at one point they were. And so prep corresponds to this sort of idea of balling your socks together. It's making them ready to be found and ready to be used. And part of this is security. This is a picture of applying a security strip to a book, which works with our physical materials to keep them from walking out the door without being checked out. Since we let people check them out, it's usually not a serious hindrance to people using the materials, but it's an important step because if the material isn't here, no one can find it. Beyond that, books are marked to indicate how they can be found uniformly. And again, since we're talking monstrous cases and we're wandering through the neighborhood, some books have additional problems. And I'll leave it under a rubric there. This is a very substantial field of preservation and conservation literature about what one can do to make materials ready for use and keep them that way. Within house, we can rebind, we can trim, we can glue things in, we can attach, we can do all sorts of fancy things. Once the book has been made secure, marked, prepped in whatever way it needs to be, it's ready to move on to the next steps, which is the put. It needs to go somewhere. Right now it's wandering around administrative offices, getting marked, and people are saying things about it. So behind the scenes, again in our monsters case, it ends up somewhere like this, in the cart corral, ready to be shelved. Workers bring it up to the floor in which it belongs, in the place it belongs, put it on shelves to be shelved initially, and the book eventually ends up on a shelf, ready to be found. But that's not the whole story. Again, remember, we have this preliminary record that began with the acquisitions and moved through metadata and cataloging, which lives in kind of this ether space related to the book, so that you can actually know on that shelf is the book that corresponds to this particular record. And this really comes down to these 4 simple steps, which I'll repeat. Get. After you get it, you note it. After you note it, you prep it, make it ready for use. After that, you put it where it goes. In the end, this gives us one side of the equation of finding something, the side of finding it that gets it where it needs to be so it can be found.